everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every week, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. You can find the schedule for upcoming presentations on my website at lindanickell.com. Tonight's guest is Alyce Bender. Alyce is a full-time professional nature photographer and educator. As a photography workshop instructor, she guides clients to some of the most diverse and fascinating places in the world to photograph the best that Mother Nature has to offer. Her photographs and articles have been featured in respected publications that include Outdoor Photographer, Landscape Photography Magazine, and the Journal of Wildlife Photography. And that's just naming a very small number. As a Tamron Ambassador, Alyce represents one of the world's leading lens companies as an educator and speaker on an array of nature photography topics. You can connect with her through her website, abenderphotography.com. And while you're there, take a minute and sign up for her newsletter. If you're on Instagram, you can find her at abenderphoto. In tonight's presentation, Low Light Landscapes, how to photograph the early, late, and moody hours of the day. Alyce will talk about the best field settings, both with tripod and in situations when hand-holding is the only option. She'll talk about gear considerations and a little bit about post-processing. Welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Bender.
Thank you so very much, Linda, for that introduction. Thank you so very much for having me back once again. So
thank you for coming back. We were kind of touching on it. I think this might be her fourth presentation, maybe fifth presentation. I don't know, but she's a stranger to my room, and she hasn't said no to me yet. So until she does, I'm going to take full advantage, and that only benefits you guys in the room. Okay, so because I know you personally, and I may have glossed over something in your introduction. If there's something you want to fill in, take the opportunity to do that, please.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, once again, Linda, and thank you all, everyone in the room and everyone listening, for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and join us tonight, or if you're listening afterwards, for listening in. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about low light photography, and this is not for astrophotography, okay? This is going to be your early and late hours, maybe your moody hours. You got that thick cloud cover. So just wanted to let you know, like, we aren't going to be touching on things like stars, aurora, like not the nighttime. I am typically a solar powered photographer, so sun up to sundown kind of thing. So this is at those kind of shoulders of the day, those early and late hours, right as you're getting out in the field and right before you leave the field. So with that, for those of you who don't know me, and thank you once again, Linda, for that amazing introduction. A little bit about my background for those of you who don't know me personally is that I am based out of Las Vegas, Nevada, and I am a Air Force veteran. My background is actually in aeronautics with studies in airport management and aviation safety. And I know that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with photography, but I have been photographing since childhood. It has been my primary passion and hobby since I was knee high. And when I got out of the Air Force, I had met my husband while in. He's still active. And so I started as a military spouse. We move around quite a bit. So in 2014, I started my photography as kind of a secondary job as a secondary kind of side income, like so many photographers do. And then in 2019, I became the full-time nature photographer that I am today, with some growth between then and now. And as Linda said, I now do primarily I do tours all over the Northern Hemisphere currently, and I am planning on expanding further as time and scouting allows. But domestically and internationally, from Japan to Portugal, the Faroe Islands, and all across the US. So I travel upwards of 120 days a year, both domestically and internationally. And that means that frequently I'm having to take advantage of whatever conditions nature doles out wherever I am in the world. And places like Alaska, places like Costa Rica, where you have dense jungle, places like the Faroe Islands, where you have moody maritime, very, quick moving, often, strong weather patterns. You have to know how to deal with low light conditions if you're going to be doing any photography there. Otherwise, you're going to be very limited in what you can photograph because it's not always going to be sunny 16. So that's where I'm coming from when the background for this presentation and this information, okay? So I'm going to be talking about how I deal with low light situations. And much like everything else in photography as a craft and as a skill, there's more than one way to work a scene. There's more than one way to do it. So this is how I approach it, okay? So you may hear other photographers handle it differently. This is my approach. So we're going to talk about gear, settings. I'm going to give you some general field tips with tripod and hand holding, and then I'll run you through a brief, how I do my post-processing of images. So with that being said, we'll jump right into gear, because I think to start out with low light photography, gear, there are some specifics that you're going to want with gear. That being said, and I apologize that my data did not get saved on this image, and I have a feeling the next image as well, because yes, those were my last little edits. So anyways, when it comes to your actual camera, I currently shoot with a Sony A1 and a Sony A7R5. Each camera is going to handle things slightly differently. It is up to you as the photographer to know how your tool works in different situations. And the way you do that is through practice and getting used to it. Obviously, we're talking about photography, so you have to have a camera. But to me, that's where it ends. I'm not going to say you have to have a full frame, you have to have a crop sensor. I think that you can have either one. They're both going to have some pros and cons to them. So it's whatever works best for you. I will tell you that with my Sony A1 and the Sony A7R5, frequently I use them in crop mode, even with landscapes, because I just don't need that many pixels for what I do. Okay, I just don't. And I'm happy to have the 1.5 optical zoom that it gives me by having that crop sensor in body. So one thing I will say though is that more modern, more up to date, the camera body, the better the technology is for handling low light situations. Now, if you compare, say, the A1 to the A7R5, I will say the A1 handles low light much better than the A7R5. So the A7R5 is the newer camera out of those two, but the A1 actually handles it better. Yet the A1 also is newer compared to, say, a Nikon D7, 7000, or a Nikon D500 digital SLR. So when I say more modern, that's what I'm talking about. There's the upgrades, and then there's, those slight upgrades. Do your research. If you're going to be doing a lot of low light photography, then you're really going to want to do your research and reviews on which camera body you get in order to help ensure that you get a camera body that will handle low light with minimal noise. That's the biggest thing, is you want to limit the amount of noise in the image. And there's multiple ways to do that, which we'll talk about. The next thing in a camera body that I look for is weather resistance and weatherproofing. Because, well, if we're going to be out in moody weather, that typically means clouds. That can mean precipitation. So I want to make sure that if I start getting rained on, I'm not worried about my camera gear, especially considering how much new camera gear costs nowadays. So I always make sure that my camera gear is weatherproofed in the stock build. You do have the option of adding covers, but that adds another layer of something you have to work with in the field. You have to carry it with you. You have to remember to put it on in time. If you don't, then you're putting a cover over moisture, and something that's not weather sealed. So then that moisture has even more time to penetrate. So to me, starting out with something that is stock built with that water resistance, with that sealant, is your best option. So for me, those are the models that I look for. Okay. And then I look at weight and ergonomic considerations. So for me, I have big hands. I like cameras that I feel aren't going to cramp my hands if I'm in the field for a bunch of hours. So when I went to mirrorless, I made sure that my mirrorless cameras actually would fit a battery grip. Why? Not only does it give me an extra battery for additional battery life, but it also gives me additional heft and additional grip on my camera, so my hand fits better. Okay. I have had many clients out in the field with me who are told that they are buying the best package for whatever type of photography it is, whether it's wildlife or landscape, whatever it is. They're being told that they're getting the best package, but they never actually go into a store and handle the camera. They just read the reviews or listen to the reviews and buy it based simply off of that. Then they get into the field and it's either too large and too heavy, or it's too small and they feel like they're going to break it, and it's just not working with them ergonomically. So I highly, highly, highly recommend you make sure that you go into a camera store, and this helps support those brick and mortar stores. Go into a camera store and handle your camera before you purchase it. If you live in an area, because I do know that there are some areas of the country that do not have a brick and mortar store. If you don't, I highly encourage you to rent a camera body before you buy it, so that you can actually feel it in your hands and hold it while you're working for just a weekend and see how it works for you. Okay. That's a big one. Moving on from cameras, let's talk about the lenses. With low light landscape, you really can use any lens range, from ultra wide to telephoto. Typically, I carry with me my Tamron 17 to 50 and my Tamron 50 to 400. Those are the two lenses that I use the most with the Sony mirrorless cameras. So here we have 3 different images. You can see one's at 17, one's at 49, and one's at 400 millimeters. Okay, taken all across the world, different ranges, different images, all in low light. Okay, so it's not going to be a matter of what lenses you have. You can do this with any lens in your kit. Okay, it's just a matter of finding the subject, and subjects are all around you. Okay, so again, when it comes to lenses, much like camera body, things I look for are going to be weather sealing and your weight and ergonomic considerations. If your lens is too heavy for you to handhold and you're going into a situation that you are most likely going to have to handhold, well, then maybe that lens isn't the right lens for you. Maybe you need to look for a lens that's a little bit lighter. So maybe instead of the 50 to 400, you go with the Tamron 50 to 300, which is almost a pound less. You're losing 100 millimeters, but the weight is significantly less. Okay, so there are change ups that you can make based on what your physical capabilities are and what you are looking for and what works for you. All right. And also I don't use primes. I use variable lenses. I don't like changing lenses in the field if I can avoid it. And variable lenses just allow me to work a scene a lot more and come back with a lot more images than if I just am stuck with a prime lens. So I always highly encourage variable lenses. Moving on. This is one of the few topics that I actually say that you do need a tripod for almost everything. I always have a tripod with me. Now, I may not always use it, but I always have it with me when photographing landscapes, especially in low light. I use the Benro Tortoise 35C. It's a carbon fiber. What I look for in a tripod is going to be something that's lightweight. Because if it's clunky, if it's heavy, if you don't want to carry it, you're not going to carry it. If it's heavy and you do carry it and you set it up, you're not going to want to move it around. And that's going to limit how many compositions you then create. So especially if you're traveling, especially if you're hiking, you really want something that's lightweight. So look for things that are done, look for carbon fiber tripods. And then you want a tripod that's going to be sturdy. So many times I have clients come out with these so-called travel tripods. And they don't, sure, they're great if you are traveling with your family and you're just setting up for a quick shot at the beach or in front of the Louvre, whatever it might be, they're fine. But if you're doing actual landscape photography where you need something to hold still and stabilize several $1,000s worth of camera equipment, really look and handle that tripod, because many of the so-called travel tripods do not hold up to what I call the 3 W's, and that is wind, water, and waves. Okay. If I'm working in the Faroe Islands, oftentimes they have high winds, and that wind can send vibration through a tripod that's not very sturdy. Okay, and that's going to ruin my images, especially if I'm doing longer exposures. If I'm working a waterfall and I'm standing in the river that runs off of the base of a waterfall, and I have a tripod that's not very sturdy, that water vibration is going to ruin my images. So I want something that will hold up if I'm standing in several inches of water that's running through the legs of the tripod. And if I want to do beach, if I'm working around a beach at sunset, I want it to be able to hold up if those waves are kind of coming in and lapping at the legs. It needs to hold up and not send those vibrations upward. Okay. And then if you're doing a lot of travel, especially flying for your photography, you also want to look at something that's compact. Now, if you've got a larger photography gear closet, maybe you have a couple different tripods. Maybe you have a really sturdy one. Maybe you have one that's a little bit larger, a little bit heavier that you take out because you live in the Pacific Northwest and you're photographing waterfalls all the time, but you can drive there. And you're not really doing long hikes. So you can have a heavier one that'll stand up in the water. Then it doesn't necessarily need to be as lightweight or as compact as somebody like me, who I'm constantly having to fly to many of my destinations. But with all that said, I will say the Benro Tortoise is one that I've found that meets all of these requirements and has been with me all over the world for many years now and has not given me any issues. Okay. Along with tripods, to me, as a landscape photographer, low light or not, as soon as I buy a camera, I buy an L bracket. It is worth its weight in gold. Okay. It is worth the investment. Don't try and get away with a universal L bracket. Get the L bracket that is meant for your camera. Okay. That way you have the holes already notched out for all your ports, so you can still access all your ports, your card slot, your batteries, all that sort of thing. It's already there, but you can have your L bracket on there. Okay. The L bracket is a game changer in landscape photography, so you don't have to deal with moving your ball head to the left or right and recomposing because now suddenly your camera shifted several inches. Okay. So do yourself a favor. If you don't already have an L bracket, get an L bracket. Other accessories that you might consider are going to be a remote release. Nowadays, many cameras come with Wi-Fi in them, so you can download your camera's app and then do it from your camera or from your cell phone. And so you can do it that way. I'm a little bit old school. I like having one that's tethered. That way I'm not having to worry about batteries, things like that. You can also do it through, you can get a combination remote release and involumeter, which we'll talk about here in a bit, why you might want that. But you can get one of those. And then filters, CPL, graduated neutral density and neutral density filters. I use case filters. They're magnetic, round magnetic filters. And even though we're dealing with low light and filters take away additional stops of light, these can be really handy, especially the circular polarizer, in taking away glare and allowing more of those beautiful colors to come through and more of that detail to come through. Graduated neutral densities are great when your sky is really bright and your land is really dark because of those fading light. So at sunset, right before the sun sets, oftentimes you'll find situations where the land is in shadow already, but that sky is still really bright. You can use a graduated neutral density filter. And then regular solid neutral densities is when you might be working a little bit before darkness has actually fallen and you want to, elongate those, that shutter. You can put a neutral density on there, especially around waterfalls. Using a neutral density filter, whether it's a 3, 6 stop, just helps you drag that shutter a little bit longer, makes that silky water. So those are kind of the accessories that I carry that are, directly impact low light photography. Moving into settings. All right. So in general, capture images in RAW file format. If you're not already doing this, I put this in here because I've come across some people who still photograph in RAW, but especially for low light, make make sure that you are photographing in RAW and not JPEG. Okay. This way, when you go to post-process, you can really take advantage of all the data that is captured by your camera. So in this situation, you have a before and after. This is in the Alabama Hills, California. Pretty iconic location. But you can see kind of the before and after. There's not been huge changes made, but photographing in RAW allowed me to bring out more of that warmth, adjust the shadows, adjust the brightness, adjust basically shooting in RAW. You're going to gather all the data, have all the information that you possibly can in each one of those pixels, and then bring that into your development tool, your digital darkroom, and choose what data is presented in each one of those pixels. Okay. So your RAW is going to look flatter, duller, but it's going to have that data. All right. Then I would suggest use manual exposure mode. Okay. This does require knowledge of the exposure triangle, setting your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, how those all work together. Me personally, I leave my white balance on auto and I do autofocus. I wear glasses in the field, I wear contacts. I don't always trust my eyes. I'm nearsighted, so I don't necessarily always trust my eyes with details, especially at a distance. So I let the camera do that for me, okay? You can use manual focus if you're comfortable with it. If you're using manual focus, I suggest turning on focus peaking if your camera allows for that as an additional aid. And focus peaking is where it's going to basically highlight in a different color the areas of your image that are in focus. It's quite handy, especially with astro, but that's going into a different tangent. So use manual exposure mode. All right. And then use your histogram. And I would just say this is a blanket statement. Use your histogram. All right. Low light photography, regular landscape photography, wildlife photography, macro photography. Use your histogram. All right. If there was one thing that I can say that exponentially changed my photography and sent it where I was getting more and more images that were keepers and started building a stronger portfolio, it was when I learned how to read and use my histogram many years ago. But I can literally pinpoint that in my journey. It's one of the few things that I can pinpoint, but I can pinpoint that. And low light photography, it is so important to use your histogram. Okay. Mirrorless has made it all that much more easy because we have live histograms, which means we can see what the histogram is going to look like before we even ever trip that shutter button. Okay. For those of you who are still on digital SLRs, you can use your histogram after you've taken the image during image review. Okay. And then adjust your exposure as needed based off of that histogram. Okay. This is absolutely one of your best tools in the field, especially in low light, not just because it's low light and you want to make sure that you're protecting your highlights, but you're also trying to get as much detail and data in those shadows as possible, but also because when we're working in low light, our eyes have adjusted to that light and they can often be tricked by what we're seeing on our screen. Your histogram's not going to lie. Okay. When it comes to aperture, typically I'm using, for especially grand landscapes, typically I'm using a narrow aperture, something like an f/16 to f/22. Me personally, I like photographing all in one shot. I don't do focus stacking. I don't do focus blending. I try and get it all in one image, from front to back. And I don't typically worry about diffraction either. Some people have this where they don't like to go to f/22 because they're worried about, well, softness. And I'm like, well, I'm not seeing every leaf on those trees, on those mountains anyways. So as long as my mountains are sharp, I'm okay. Like that, as the artist, that's where my line is. That's where I'm okay. So my trees are sharp here in the front. My mountain line is sharp. So I'm okay. I'm okay with that. To each artist their own. If you feel that it's too soft, then maybe you play with fine tuning your hyperfocal distance so that you can use shallower depths of field and still get everything in. There's calculators out there that apps that you can use for hyperfocal distance. To me, I like being able to just kind of go to an f/22 and be there. And I'm good. But there are other times to use a wider aperture, such as f/6.3, where for artistic reasons, we want to have a softer foreground or a softer background based on where our subject is, where we want to lead our viewer. So in this case, out at Caddo Lake, taken a couple years ago, I really liked how the last bit of light was lighting up this tree in the background, and I was sitting in this channel elsewhere with these other trees in between. But if I had given all of these trees the same weight by making them all sharp, by having, say, an f/16 or an f/18 aperture, it wouldn't have held the same magic, I don't think. So I chose an f/6.3, focused on my subject tree. Your eye goes right to it. It's bright, it's sharp, and we're led through the forest. It builds depth. Now, this is kind of more of my signature style that I have built over the years, where I like having soft foreground that leads you to a subject, whether it's in wildlife or landscape. So it's going to depend on what your style is, what your eye is drawn to. And much like traditional landscapes, a lower ISO is better to avoid noise. So using an ISO such as an ISO 50 or 100 is great. This image was taken with an ISO 50, right? Using a long exposure. But especially in today's technology, both in camera and post-processing, don't be afraid of your ISO. All right. Use your ISO as needed based on your camera and your workflow in developing your images. Okay. I know myself, I know my cameras, especially when I'm on the A1, I can get publishable images up to 20,000 ISO because of my workflow, because of how I process, how I shoot in the field, and then what I do in post-processing. Now, I wouldn't do that with my A7R5, but if you remember, I did say that the A1 handles low light better. And I know that because I know my cameras. So know your cameras, know yourself, know your workflow. How do you work and what works best? This comes through practice. Okay. So be photographing a lot, even if it's just in your local park. Get a new camera or are trying low light for some of the first time. See how your camera does. Take test shots at different ISOs. Try them out. Put them through your usual workflow. See what works best. See where you start getting to a point where you're like, yeah, no, that's not working for me. Okay. Then we get to shutter speed. And to me, shutter speed is kind of the magic variable that, while I usually will go into a situation knowing what my aperture is going to be, My shutter speed is the next thing that I need to figure out based on my subject. And then combining that aperture with that shutter speed will give me that ISO that I need. Okay, so my shutter speed is that variable I need to figure out in order to get that ISO. All right, it's kind of like a little algebra expression that we work out in our minds on the fly somehow. But so shutter speed is going to be based on your subject and your weather conditions. So whether you're doing a long exposure because you want the waves that the wind was kicking up to smooth out on a lake at sunset, such as this one on the left where I used a 15-second exposure, got some of that cloud movement in there, smoothed out that water, created that juxtaposition between the softness of the water, the hardness of the rocks, created that contrast. Or you have a shutter speed of, 1/320, 20th of a second when you're photographing trees from a boat that has some movement to it and you're hand holding, so you have to overcome handhold shake as well, which we'll talk about. So then I'm going to be using a higher shutter speed, not because necessarily the trees are moving, but because I want to make sure my movement and my mode of transportation's movement is not impacting the sharpness of my image. Okay. So once I figure out my shutter speed, then I circle in and kind of clue in on what my ISO is going to be. When I readjust my shutter speed, I have to readjust my ISO. If I adjust my aperture, I have to readjust my ISO, okay? So for me, I typically will figure it out in that sequence. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. And then if something changes, I revisit ISO. Okay. All right. So getting into some field tips. So what do we do in the field that will help us with our low light photography? Number one is get out there before it's low light. Really get out there and kind of put boots on the ground, see what you're dealing with before you get into a low light situation. This is not only just for safety, but also compositions. This is where you can kind of try out different compositions, make, mental or physical notes on where you want to set up, at what height, things like that, that way, when you do start getting lower light that's moving faster towards darkness, you can quickly move through different compositions. But then also make sure you're staying out there for blue hour. Blue hour is going to give you these beautiful tones that so many people don't get to see. They don't enjoy because blue hour is often like supper time. So like people who've even stayed out for sunset, normally as soon as the sun sets, they pack up and are off to dinner, right? So they don't get to see blue hour. And blue hour, while it's very low light, it's also pretty even light unless you get a little bit of afterburn from the sunset bouncing off some clouds. Okay. So it can be really quite interesting to photograph and quite beautiful. So I highly encourage you to stay out for blue hour. And then depending on the time and location that you're going out, maybe even stay for moonrise and find a composition that allows you to have the moon come up. Because the moon gives off an awful lot of light. This is not, there's a reason astrophotographers want to go out on new moon nights when there isn't a moon out. It's because the moon gives off so much light. So when you do include the moon in your image, make sure you're metering off the moon in order to get that detail. because it's going to be significantly brighter than most people anticipate. Okay, so make sure you're watching that histogram. And then avoid underexposing your images, because if you underexpose, that's when you're going to have to bring your shadows up, and that's when you can introduce introduce noise into your images. That said, you want to protect your highlights, and it can be a delicate balance, especially if you're trying to get the image all in a single image instead of doing something like bracketing for an HDR type image. So make sure you're doing a proper exposure while protecting your highlights. Okay. So expose to the right, but we'll talk about, I'll give you some examples of histograms here in a moment, and you'll see for low light, exposed to the right has a slightly different meaning. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about when the light gets dim, our eyes adjust, and frequently our LCD screens can look really bright when they aren't necessarily, or they can look over or under, depending on how you have your screen set. Because some people will have their screen brightness set really low to save battery power, which is great, but then you're not getting a true representation if you're looking at it. So always reference your histogram, especially in low light situations, okay? This was taken pre-dawn, before the sun ever came above the horizon, but we still had so much light coming in. But this was something like a 320-second exposure, like really long exposure in order to get this much light, okay, on these Badlands. My eyes had adjusted enough that the screen still looked really bright, like I had blown out some of these highlights, when these highlights aren't even close to being blown out. Okay. So don't believe your screen. Don't believe your eyes when just checking the back of your screen. Look at that histogram. And I hate to say it, but we talk a lot about the light in, low light situations, finding the light, how we work with the light. Composition still matters. Okay. This is not just taking low light images for the sake of the light. Composition still matters. So make sure that you are setting yourself up in areas that still have pleasing compositions, remembering things like leading lines, foreground, midground, background. How does your viewer work through the scene? What type of story are you telling? Okay. So don't just chase light for the light, but actually work on your composition, which circles back around to being out there before it gets to be low light, so you can find those compositions more easily in brighter light. And if you have really dynamic light, consider cutting out the sky. So this is a really popular location called McWay Falls on the Big Sur coast in California. And you can kind of see, I did an inset here where I took a picture of the back of my camera, and you can see how bright it still is on the, in the sky region. And by keeping the sky out of it, there was nothing really interesting about the sky. The sky wasn't adding anything to the story. So by coming just below the horizon with my framing, I keep that really bright highlights out of there, and I'm able to concentrate on just the shadowed areas of this McWay Falls and how the light's coming in and hitting that waterfall with the last little bit of rays. And I would be remiss, and anybody who knows me would probably heckle me even more than they did prior to us recording. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention creative ways to use low light situations. Okay. I love intentional camera movement, but it's only one of many ways that you can use low light. You can use low light to do things like silhouettes. Photographing in Arizona, I was trying to kind of come up with more creative ways during sunrise to document the desert environment and to do silhouettes of these pines against that low light sunrise. Then we have our intentional camera movement. It's also a great time to do things like black and white, especially if you're, dealing with high shadows in, say, slot canyons in the desert Southwest. You can do black and white, really kind of draw the viewer in and show them exactly where that light is hitting by using that contrast of black and white being light, black being shadows, and just using that, taking the color out of the story. And then even going into light painting, you don't necessarily have to do something as dramatic as steel wool spinning as pictured here, but even just doing some, light painting in those low light hours is a great way to add additional depth to a scene if you are into adding artificial lighting to your scenes and are in an area that you can. Note that, especially in the West, many national parks are now not allowing things like light painting. So do double check depending on where you're photographing. When it comes to tripod use, some specifics when you're working on a tripod. If you're on a digital SLR, ensure that you are using your mirror lockup, because if you don't, that slap of the mirror coming up when you take the image can introduce vibration into your camera. Okay. And that can give vibration to your image. You also want to make sure you turn off your image stabilization, vibration reduction, whatever your camera and lens company designates it as. You want to make sure that that's turned off, either through the lens, camera body, or both. Wherever your vibration reduction motors are, you want to make sure that that is turned off, because those motors, if they are sat still and they are trying to compensate for vibration that isn't there, it can actually introduce vibration. Okay. And then use bulb mode. So on many digital cameras, whether they're digital SLR or mirrorless, if you are going beyond 30 seconds of exposure time, they use what's called bulb mode. And that's when you need either an involumeter or a remote release, and you will then be in charge of how long that shutter stays open. So in that Badlands image that was 320 seconds, that's when I had the involumeter out and I had it pushed and locked, and I was watching my watch, 320 seconds. Then I released. That's how I got that image. So if you are going beyond 30 seconds, you will need some sort of release so that you can lock your shutter open and then pull it close when you want the exposure to end. Okay. For hand holding, you want to make sure that your vibration reduction, image stabilization, what have you, is turned on. Okay. Very important. You also want to make sure that you use proper posture for additional stabilization. The camera sutra, if you will. Proper posture when photographing will give you that extra stabilization so that you can be more steady. Now, if you are able to, And this is where I like to do a lot of my work since I do a lot of hand holding, is I like to lay down. The ground is very stable in most places. And so by doing that and having my elbows down, I've now created essentially a tripod without having to carry one. So if I can't do that, maybe I just sit and, use my knee and my elbow. There's entire decks of cards, and it's almost a cheat sheet that you can find on different types of posing as a photographer to give you more stability out there. And this is a time when you want to really start using your ISO so that you can increase your shutter speed to overcome things like handshake, or oftentimes we find ourselves having to handhold because we're on specialized transportation like boats or in canoes. And so we're having to overcome both the instability of our shooting platform as well as our natural movement, handshake movement as well. So be aware of that. And so when you're hand holding, you most likely are also going to be using higher ISOs. So that's the trade-off. No tripod, but higher ISO. Okay. Now, I want to bring in forests, because whether you're dealing with forests like rainforests, or if you're working in evergreen forests like up in the Pacific Northwest or in Alaska, there's a lot you can do, but frequently they are really dark. Okay, so some things to consider for forests specifically. And that is, one, when using your macro, use a wider aperture so that you can focus on small subjects while also using those small highlights in the background, like where light does peek through, and turning that into beautiful little bokeh balls. Okay. So that's something that I really love being able to do in dark forests, is find these little highlights and then find where there's highlights in the background so that I can have like this magical bokeh. Because especially with the Tamron lenses that have such beautiful bokeh, like it just lends itself to that. So I will poke around in dark forests all day long for macro subjects like this. For larger scenes, I find they require patience, not just because you're having to make sense of the chaos that is forests frequently, but you also have to have patience because if there's any wind, any air movement, frequently that foliage is also going to be moving. So because it's dark, we're going to be using a longer shutter speed. And so if we are patient, we can often find, what I like to say is, when Earth kind of pauses, holds its breath, and that's when we want to photograph, okay, during that pause. Sometimes we can be waiting a bit, okay, but that's going to be worth it when we have sharp foliage without that movement, okay. And then there's times where you just kind of have to figure out what your compromise is going to be between your shutter speed and ISO in those situations, depending on how hard the wind is blowing and your actual, how dark it is, how hard the wind is blowing, and your time consideration. So that again is very artist specific and situation specific as to where you want to call that compromise. All right, post-processing. So I'm not going to lie to you. This is probably the part that I really don't like about photography. I know it's part of the process, but I don't like being in front of the computer. That's why I like nature photography. I want to be out in nature. I like to say I have the largest office on the planet because the planet is my office. Out of all of the images that I've shown you in this presentation, There has only been one image that has been an HDR image. All the other images in this presentation have been single image shots. Okay. I don't like working in front of the computer. I keep things as simple as possible. Okay. I use Adobe Lightroom Classic, and this is my typical workflow for low light images. So once I've gone through cold, picked out which ones I want, I will import them into Lightroom. And upon import for all of my images, I have it set up that Lightroom automatically removes chromatic aberrations. Okay, that is done for every single image that I import into Lightroom. All right. Then what I do is I crop and straighten my image if I need to. And I remove any visible dust spots, especially when we're working with apertures of like f16, f18, f22. Your dust spots are going to be visible if you have any dust spots. And with mirrorless cameras, if you've changed your lens in the field, the likelihood of you having a dust spot is pretty high. So remove dust spots. Then I make my kind of global adjustments. So these are adjustments that will apply to the entire image. These are going to be exposure. My most common ones are going to be exposure, highlights, shadows, contrasts, and texture. Okay. Those are my top 5. Then I will run it. If it needs any denoise, I will run it through Topaz denoise at this stage, once I've made my global adjustments. Because if I need to, increase shadows, increase exposure, then that can introduce more noise. So I want to do my denoise after I've made these adjustments. All right. Again, this is my personal workflow. Other people may do it differently. This is how I do it. Once that's been done and Topaz kicks it back into Lightroom for me, I make my smaller local adjustments through masking. And my personal favorite mask is going to be the radial gradient mask. That's just the one that I find I use the most of. Once I'm done doing my mask to make my small adjustments throughout an image, I do my final check for any dust spots. They are my pet peeve. I decide whether an image will get a vignette or not. If it's going to get a vignette, I'll put it on at this point, and then I will export for web, for social media, for print, for publication, whatever it might be, then I export. Okay. That is literally my entire post-processing in a nutshell. To give you kind of an idea of what it looks like, this is one that I've done quite a bit of masking to. This was one of my more intensive images. I typically don't like spending more than a handful of minutes per image. Again, I don't like being in front of the computer for editing. But here we can see my histogram. And this is where you can see, yes, I have some dark areas. That's what that little triangle on the left-hand side of the histogram is telling me, is that there's some shadows that are pure black, some pixels that are pure black. Well, in this situation, I'm okay with that, because when I'm standing there, I'm not seeing everything under that rock. I'm very realistic with my images. If I couldn't see it in real life, why should I see it in my picture? Okay. So for me, the fact that there might be a few pixels back in that far cave that are pure black, I'm okay with that. Overall, the image is well balanced. I have detail through the vast majority of it, and my highlights are not blown out in that waterfall. Okay. So with that being said, this small panel on the left, just underneath the before and after picture, these are my global adjustments. This is my basic panel. I adjusted the temperature slightly, my exposure, my contrast, highlight, shadows, and whites. And I also brought up the vibrance just slightly. Those were my global. This image did not get taken into Topaz, did not have any additional denoise. It was shot at ISO 50, so really no noise to deal with. So once I did my global adjustments, then I go to my masking. And you can see there was quite a few masks, but you can see they're in very small spots throughout. Okay. And each one of these masks would have very few movements to them. Things like, oh, I'm going to bring down the shadows here, or bring up the contrast there, or bring down the highlights here. That sort of thing. They're normally very quick edits. But you can see how many of them are radials. So yeah, so this is what I would consider a heavily processed image for myself with this many masks. And this is the final product. To me, you shouldn't be able to tell that I did any masking. It should look very natural. Again, my style. So beware of overcooking images if you are going for a natural style. You may not be. Your style may be more hyper realism, where you do kind of bring out kind of some of those more flamboyant colors and textures and things. And that's great. If that's your style, that's great. If that's what you're going for as the artist, fine. Do that. We don't all have to see and do the same things. But if you're trying for a natural look, be aware of overcooking your images. And with that, the sun sets on this presentation. And I hope that you enjoyed it and had some takeaways. And I'd love to open it up to questions. If you all would like to join me in the field and have me teach you one-on-one, these are some of my upcoming tours in this 2025-2026 calendar. And you can find me on Instagram and social media at abenderphoto, my website, abenderphotography.com once again. And thank you to both Linda and Tamron for continuing to host me. But yeah, I'd love to open it up to any questions that you all might have at this time.
So this is Kevin, your buddy Kevin. His question is, I suspect I know the answer, but does your post-processing ever or sometimes include sharpening?
Yeah, I mean, it'll include sharpening, selective sharpening, and then I also do sharpening on export, normally for screen. It's just the typical Lightroom has that on export.
Okay. Flipping through here, I'm surprised I didn't see any questions other than his. I'm going to give somebody 1 second to type faster. But
If I may, if you all do think of any questions, whether it's 3 hours from now or 3 months from now, please feel free to reach out to me. Send me a message, social media, email, whatever it might be, and I will get back with you just as soon as I can. I have no problem answering questions.
No, you don't. Okay, there is Dan snuck one in real quick. Do you ever use exposure bracketing?
I don't normally.
Okay. Okay.
No.
A lot of nice comments in here, and as always, I'll share the chat with you. All right, Bender, thank you for coming again and sharing what you know, and you know a lot. So there's a reason that I keep asking you to come back. So, but I really do appreciate your time, and um, images and energy. And I really do um, love that you participate and contribute to the Happiness Hour project. So,
Thank you so much for having me once again.
yeah. All right, next week, Curtis Hoover joins us to share his presentation, Life Along the River in Photographs. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you again soon.